Chapter 7. Isabella knew that sabotage of some manner would come. It wasn't in the nature of almost any in the royal court to let any slight go without some sort of response. Count Faust was a diplomat, but that didn't mean he was somehow less ruthless. Her job, then, was to identify what was going wrong and fix it as soon as possible. She had to put out the fires before they spread, right alongside keeping up appearances for the Ambrosian envoys. Coordination was paramount, both for her enemies and her allies. She had thought of one rather effective way to put them on relatively even grounds. Before the meeting began in earnest, many of the attendant diplomats crowded outside. Isabella left Arthur to his own devices and went into the crowd. It didn't take long for Isabella to find and approach Count Faust, who stood amidst several of his compatriots. The conversation died when she approached, and all of the high-ranking men looked at her silently. "Count Faust," Isabella said, looking at him in the eyes. "You're going to accompany me tonight as my translator." "What?" he said, setting down his goblet on a nearby servant's platter. "Your Highness, I can think of many better qualified for the job." "Are you refusing?" Isabella asked. He scoffed. "Well, no, but once the reception begins, you're to stay near me at all times in case I have need of you," she said. "Is that understood?" The Count looked to be swallowing some bitter retorts, but he nodded and said, "Yes, Your Highness." Isabella gave a curt nod and turned away. She could understand the Ambrosian language decently, though she wasn't quite as adept at speaking it. The purpose of assigning Count Faust as her translator was to keep him close and kill his coordination with his allies. Furthermore, she wanted to give him an opportunity to betray her in translation. If he did that, he'd be giving her the rope to hang him. She walked around the other nobles, looking for one man in particular. It didn't take her long to find him. He was somewhat isolated. A man in very light, yet fanciful clothes peered upon the fountain, his hand resting on the pommel of the sword strapped to his waist. Isabella thought it somewhat cold, but this man came from the frigid north. This weather would feel like a pleasant summer's breeze to him. "Archduke Felix," she greeted. The Archduke turned to look at her. He was an older man well into his 40s, but he looked markedly younger. He had dark hair and intimidating maroon eyes. He was a widower with 2 children, both of whom were grown daughters. His wife died not long after Edgar the Great's war to conquer the North. After the North's armies were shattered, Felix swore fealty to her father as the Archduke of the North, demoting him from the position of king. Felix liked to play the part of neutrality, but in truth, he was one of the most active schemers of all. This is where her knowledge of the future came into play. "How are your daughters?" she asked him, a polite question, but one that should intrigue him. Felix regarded her curiously. "They are both well, Your Highness. Thank you for asking. Your daughter Lady Abigail. She's in the capital at present, yes?" Isabella said, and Felix's face grew stern. "I believe that she's of an age where you're considering her marriage." Felix looked around, but once he was certain no one was within earshot, said, "That isn't public knowledge, Your Highness. I would like it very much if the lady could join me in the royal palace, sometime," Isabella said. "Her situation reminds me of my brother's. He's also yet unwed. It's an important matter for the king, wouldn't you agree?" Felix's stern expression lessened somewhat. "It is important. I agree. Then might I send her an invitation sometime in the near future?" The Archduke raised his glass up in partial salute. "I believe she would be receptive, Your Highness." "Wonderful." Isabella smiled. "I look forward to it." Abigail had developed a rather marred reputation in Isabella's past life. She was called the Graveyard Bride. During her life, she had married 7 kings, each at her father's arrangement. Archduke Felix was a man utterly determined to establish his bloodline on the throne by any means necessary. Abigail was eventually accused of participating in the murder of all her husbands, and hanged. After his daughter's execution, the Archduke seceded from the Kingdom of Dauphine, and with the royal court in chaos, no effort was ever made to reclaim the lost territory. In truth, there wasn't much Isabella could do to further his ambitions, but he wouldn't know that. An alliance forged under false pretenses would need to suffice, for now. If she hadn't reached out, she was certain he'd take Faust's side. And he might be a lifeline to escape Duke Albert, Isabella reflected. He's older than me, but nothing can be worse than the Duke. After the two biggest threats to her had been somewhat curbed, she moved toward the ambassadorial building. She intended to check with the catering staff to be sure that there were no last-minute changes made designed to make her look foolish before the eyes of the ambassadors. She was stopped at the entrance by a knight, but he quickly allowed her to pass once she asked for his name and surname. She wandered through the building, drawing eyes from the people that still diligently worked to set up the event. In time, she found the person giving orders, and approached them. The man read from a list in his hands, barely paying attention to his surroundings. He was large and burly, and clearly a stern fellow. "Already finished your damn job, or is there a problem?" he asked, not looking away from the list. "Have there been any last-minute changes made?" "What?" The man turned his head, and then his eyes widened. From her eyes and hair alone, most would recognize her as a member of the royal family, especially a member of the staff. "Ah, your Your Highness. Forgive me for my use of profane language, in the presence of your most esteemed personage. Has anyone changed anything?" she repeated. The man thought hard, obviously flustered. "I mean, such as course changes, seating arrangements, etc., Isabella clarified. Given clear instructions, the man nodded and launched into a fast-paced explanation. "Yes, there has been a few major, minor adjustments. Apparently there were a few too many chairs and tables, so we gave those to another event that asked to lend them, among other moderate and temperate changes that were of no inconvenience to me and my staff." Isabella almost sighed, but held herself back. It was an unbelievably petty manner of sabotage, but every little tick against her would add up. "You need to rescind any changes you might have made because of orders received in the past day or so." "What?" He looked at her and swallowed. "Are you certain about that?" "Absolutely," Isabella said. "There's been a serious miscommunication." "But," he huffed, caught off balance. "Meaning no disrespectfulness, Your Highness, but without the old plans." "I happen to have them," Isabella said, pulling a scroll out of her dress sleeve. She'd come prepared. "You shouldn't have any trouble re-implementing these, yes?" Count Faust already felt a little out of sorts when the princess prudently requested that he act as her translator. She wasn't as naive as he'd thought, and she'd clearly thought through the repercussions of her actions. Still, it was the death of 1,000 cuts that would get to her. Every small little detail going wrong, leading up to the climactic event. The Count followed closely behind the princess and her partner for the event, Arthur of Hamor. The presence of the Archwizard did shift the balance of power somewhat, but it was nothing beyond what Faust had been ready for. They entered the hall, where they'd greet and sup with the ambassadors, and this is the old floor plan, he realized almost immediately. He looked back at the man who said that he'd take care of things, make it awkward for the guests. But the Baron responsible looked just as surprised as Faust felt. Did the orders not make it down, or? "I have to thank you for your diligent work, Count Faust," Isabella said. "You've made the day very easy for me. Rest assured, I'll let His Majesty know of your leal and able service." Faust smiled pleasantly, but fiddled with his collar as he felt a little hot. She caught on, reversed our changes. "But who talked?" "There are the ambassadors," Isabella said. "Let's go greet them, Count." They walked into the center of the hall, where the ambassadors were led in by calm servants and directed throughout the room. The majority of them were old men, few youths among their numbers. They all wore themselves as the Ambrosians often did, with large, bushy beards immaculate trimmed to a point, tall hats over their heads, and long robes. It was difficult to distinguish their rank. One needed to look for the style of hat they wore. Faust waited for Princess Isabella to turn to him for direction or a translation, but to his surprise, she stepped forward ahead of all and offered her hand to the leading ambassador. She had picked out the highest-ranking ambassador without issue. "Welcome to the land of Dorvain," Ambassador, Isabella greeted impassible Ambrosen. I'm Princess Isabella of Dauphine. The king had given me the honor of hosting you for our talks today. I speak for my family on this afternoon in bidding you welcome. There was some murmuring among the ambassadors. It was quite rare for one of the royalty to personally involve themselves in ambassadorial receptions. Faust wondered if Isabella truly spoke Ambrosen, or if she had rehearsed to give a planned greeting. It is not so unpleasant to hear one's tongue spoken from the mouth of a princess, the lead ambassador said in Dauphine's native language. He was an aged man, with grey barely framing his black beard. Your welcome has already been well received simply by the quarters we've stayed within. I am Giovanni Moro, the head ambassador. Faust studied Isabella as she engaged with the head ambassador calmly. He had to admit that she had taken this role with good reason. Despite her reputation as someone taciturn and unapproachable, she was at least able to hold a conversation. Still, it won't matter, Faust thought. It's bound to end in disaster. The Duke of the Isles, Valerio, had been designated a top priority criminal by the Republic of Ambrose for his piracy. Faust had arranged for him to arrive just before the negotiations began. A discreet word here and there about the fact that she had danced with him at the coronation, perhaps some fabrications here and there, and even Faust himself couldn't keep things from falling apart by that point. His people knew their role, and they'd execute even without him. Asterisk. Duke Valerio put together his outfit in the mirror. An older man in a butler's uniform stood in the background, his hands politely behind his back. Going for the look of a petty lordling again, I see, the old man said politely. You know I can't show off too much wealth, Roderick, Valerio said. Storm's coming. I want fewer eyes on me, not more. Then why are you heeding the invitation of Count Faust? Roderick stepped forward. He's obviously intending to use you as a cudgel against that princess. Because I need to squash the problems with the Republic of Ambrose now. Valerio looked back. It's important for the future. You could do it in a less public setting, I'm sure, Roderick pointed out. Valerio looked back into the mirror. A little flair and ceremony won't hurt. This is diplomacy, after all. He put a singular gold ring on, then closed and opened his hand. Besides, my protector is there. Your what? Roderick asked in confusion. Valerio smiled lightly. Nothing. Chapter 8 Isabella sat at a round table with the head ambassador Giovanni, Arthur, Count Faust, the Archduke Felix, and a few other ambassadors and minor nobility. Thus far, it had been a very tense dinner for her. Giovanni, however, didn't seem to notice. She believed that he thought little was amiss. Arthur was busy speaking to the lesser ambassadors who could best supply his need for magic supplies. He had barely spoken with anyone else the entire event. Count Faust had translated whatever he'd heard the envoys say in Ambrosen, and thus far, he hadn't deviated from what she heard. The Archduke had acted mildly in her favor, but he was clearly not being too aggressively supportive of her. After this lunch, the negotiations would begin. And the clock was ticking ever nearer. Can you tell me what we should expect of King Edgar's foreign policy? Giovanni asked her. An official communication as to his intents toward his neighbors and allies would do much to ease tensions. One king can differ entirely from another, so it would be good to establish a baseline. Isabella took a drink of water to delay her answer. I believe that's a subject best saved for the negotiations, Ambassador. True enough, Giovanni admitted, but then cast his gaze toward the grandfather clock. But looking at the time, it's nearly time to begin. Why don't we set the tone for negotiations with that matter? A servant politely said at her side, Your Highness. She turned, and the man bent down to whisper. The organizer asked for me to inform you that there's been another change attempted by one of the nobles. Go on, she told him quietly. The Duke of the Isles is at the entrance to the hall, he said. He is on his way to this room imminently. What shall we do? Isabella closed her eyes to keep her composure. Did she want to offend yet another duke? As far as she knew, the Duke of the Isles was a wanted criminal within Ambrose. The servants or the guards didn't have the authority to restrain a duke, and she didn't want them to be punished on her account. She didn't have the clout to protect them. "Allow him passage," she told the servant. The man nodded and walked away. She focused back on the ambassador. "Is there some trouble?" Giovanni asked, one hand stroking his large beard. Count Faust stared at her with a measure of triumph in his features. If she'd known this had been what the man was planning, she would have done more to prepare. Perhaps it had been a mistake to write off the Duke of the Isles. A man made a duke by the sheer force of his legacy wasn't someone that could be easily ignored. "To answer your question, Ambassador Giovanni," Isabella began, deciding to rip off the bandage now. "His Majesty currently favors a mandate of change. He doesn't want to maintain the status quo, even if it means he must dig up things that have long been buried." Giovanni, perhaps not expecting such a forthright response, focused on Isabella intently. "Could you elaborate?" "We understand that there's much bad blood between the Ambrosans and a member of our high nobility," Isabella said. "I believe that it's in the best interest of both our nations to put this problem to bed before it simmers over." Giovanni stared at her with a gaze of iron. All of the other ambassadors nearby also came to attention. "The Duke of the Isles will soon be arriving, and I'd like for him to be a part of the negotiations." Giovanni slammed his hand on the table, and the loud rattling of the glassware brought silence to the whole hall. Nearly everyone turned their head to see the noise. Isabella tried to remain steadfast, but she was quite anxious about how this might spiral out of control. Before either her or Giovanni could say something, the double doors in the back of the hall parted. Duke Valerio walked in with long strides. He wore a frilly white shirt with a deep neckline and black pants, a fairly sizable dagger hanging from his waist. The clothes were form-fitting, but that did little to diminish his presence. No one could ignore his arrival. Giovanni stood up from the table, the chair creaking loudly. "The princess would have us engage in a civil conversation with a mad beast at her side. A shark that swims at the smell of blood, an inhuman freak? I would have you make peace with Duke Valerio," she said, also rising to her feet. "The head ambassador shouldn't mistake a gesture of peace and honesty as anything other than what it is. Call it whatever you will. But is this not an ambush?" Giovanni said, his voice dark. Duke Valerio called out, "You wouldn't have to ask that question if this was an ambush." He walked up to their table, then took an untouched apple from the platter. "Hello, Giovanni," he said in practiced Ambrosan. Giovanni stepped away from the table, shouting to his people in Ambrosan, "Convene in my room." The Count was about to translate, but Giovanni reiterated in the common tongue, "We're going to discuss. Frankly, I think this negotiation may already be over." The envoys of the Republic all left the room, almost in lockstep with Giovanni. Hateful gazes were cast in the direction of Duke Valerio, who watched all of them without much change in his expression. Next, many eyes went to her and Valerio, who were the only ones standing. Count Faust leaned into the table, looking up at Isabella. "If you're curious about his extreme reaction, Your Highness." He looked at Duke Valerio. "This man killed Giovanni's son. The boy was the captain of a trading ship. I imagined most of the envoys here today have experienced some tragedy at the hands of our Duke of the Isles raids. He is rather notorious in the Republic." Isabella looked all around. From the expressions of satisfaction and relief, it looked as though the majority of the people here today had spent their hours poisoning the envoys against her, bolstering her connection with the Duke of the Isles. She turned her head to look at him. "Come with me," she said decisively, staring him in the eyes. Asterisk. Isabella quickly secured a room for her and Valerio to speak of things. When the servants had shut the door, she looked at him firmly. "Why are you here?" Valerio drew the knife at his waist, and Isabella narrowed her eyes. When he cut a perfect wedge out of the apple he'd taken, her concern evaporated. "Count Faust invited me," Valerio said simply, then put the apple slice in his mouth. "And you're well known for attending events," she said dryly. "It's not as though you very rarely show your face in public." Valerio carved off another wedge of the apple, a smile on his face. "You seem to explain it quite well, Your Highness. I'm here to put bad blood to rest." Assassination attempts ordered by men like Giovanni have made my sleep schedule somewhat erratic. He pointed his knife. If this keeps going on, my people could get hurt. Isabella inhaled. She said what felt like a natural excuse, but it turned out to be partially truthful. You're here to make peace, then, Isabella said in revelation. If you have other intentions. If Count Faust has offered you something. I'm not for sale, he said, walking closer to her. And I have no interest in torturing pretty young women who already seem to have enough problems on their plate. Isabella didn't feel compelled to step away. Then. Thank you, I suppose. Thank you. Valerio raised a brow, expertly cutting another apple slice. I don't recall doing anything warranting thanks, Your Highness. Are you going to be a hindrance in negotiations? She asked. If you want to make peace with them, then we need to have a tacit understanding. What do you think? He asked. Do I seem like a mad beast to you, incapable of reasoning? Isabella pursed her lips. Thus far, it was hard to connect the way that Valerio acted to the rumors about him. But these things could hide out of view for hours, days, months before showing themselves. Sometimes, a person only needed to be in the right place at the right time for something fundamental about themselves to rise to the surface. He certainly used that knife well enough. On an apple, granted. Rather than answer his question, Isabella asked, Did you kill Giovanni's son? Valerio's dark eyes watched her for a time, and he didn't hasten to answer. I've killed my share. You raise the black flag at sea, it's inevitable. He paused for a while, perhaps gauging her reaction. But I made much of my gold ransoming captives. I wouldn't kill the son of a prominent patrician family in the Republic of Ambrose. Isabella looked into his eyes, searching for any signs of deception. It was somewhat hard for her to believe that this man was the feared pirate lord. He was certainly fearsome-looking, but he spoke well and carried himself with the same poise that she saw in the other nobles all around her. If this goes well, you'll owe me, she said. I won't begrudge you coming here if these people were truly sending assassins after you, but you've caused me problems. Valerio cut the final slice of the apple off, holding it on the blade of his knife as he said, Fair enough, Your Highness. Isabella reached out and took the final apple slice off his dagger, then put it in her own mouth. He stared at her incredulously for a moment, then shook his head with an amused laugh. He retrieved a cloth from his pocket, cleaned his knife, then put it back at his waist. Isabella looked at his face again. This may sound a strange question. But were your eyes always that color? Valerio's reaction was composed, but Isabella couldn't miss his surprise. She didn't need for him to answer to know that her question had struck onto something. Never mind, Isabella said, not wanting to pry too deeply. Her curiosity needn't make things tense in the negotiation to come. She doubted it was overly important, anyhow. That's absurd. Valerio said nothing more on the subject, gesturing for the door. Shall we? When she and Valerio exited the private room, Arthur had been standing near the door. His suspicious eyes glanced between the two of them. She assumed he'd been making sure that no one approached, and that nothing happened as she was talking with the Duke of the Isles. If that was true, he was a surprisingly gracious person. Arthur looked at her. The ambassadors wished for me to inform you that they are willing to receive you whenever you're ready, Your Highness. Isabella nodded, lost in thought. Duke Valerio walked ahead of them, giving them some space to speak privately. Are you all right? Arthur asked her, then looked around. These people. The things they're saying. She looked into his eyes and saw some concern. Ah. Don't worry yourself. It could always be worse. She'd heard plenty of the insults levied today. They'd called her greedy, arrogant, naive. They'd said she needed to be put in her place. Compared to the court a year from now, these were relatively mild comments. This event could be likened to a stiff winter's breeze after bathing in ice water. More importantly, have you managed to get what you need? She asked. Arthur narrowed his eyes. Is that more important? You. Never mind. He shook his head and rubbed the bridge of his nose. I have, Your Highness. Master Ludovico and I have entered into an arrangement to supply each other with magic goods from our own respective regions. Wonderful. You can leave now if you'd like. I look forward to working with you on my monologue, she said. If we leave separately. Arthur trailed off. She tilted her head. That's better for your reputation, isn't it? You already did me the favor of keeping out of Faust's schemes. I appreciate that. There might be more I can do here, Your Highness, Arthur said. More trade arrangements? All right, Isabella said. Good luck. Isabella passed by Arthur and went to rejoin Duke Valerio, who looked out at the nobles with an undecipherable expression on his face. How well do you speak Ambrosan? She asked the Duke of the Isles. He looked at her. I lived in the Republic for 5 years, Your Highness. She stared at him for a little longer until he elaborated, I speak it quite well. Then you and I will talk to the ambassadors alone, first, she said. And since you'll owe me a favor once this is over, you won't ask any questions about how I know the things that I do. No questions. Easy enough. He studied her. Still, the man just slammed the table and walked out at the sight of me. You honestly want me to be your number 2? Of course. Isabella looked in the direction of the ambassadorial quarters. It'll be easier for them to take my threats seriously. He scoffed. Threats? Isabella didn't elaborate, walking forward with confidence. Chapter 9. Isabella and Valerio sat down at the head of the table, opposite Giovanni and his 2 closest aides, whose name Isabella didn't know. The gazes cast their way were cold, expressionless, a far cry from the polite amiability that had been directed toward them not half an hour ago. Here is the situation as we understand it, Princess Isabella, Giovanni began, foregoing the pleasantries of the lunch before them. King Edgar II has proven to be a decisive and expectant man. Already, we've heard of several incidents that intrigue us at this event. His purging of the royal dungeon. His last-minute demotion of Count Faust for your appointment in his stead. Decisive and expectant were likely euphemisms for arbitrary and delusional. His polite framing even amidst this scenario proved his talent as the head ambassador. Isabella waited for him to continue politely. All of the lesser ambassadors, who should be serving underneath you, are instead looking to the demoted Count Faust for their cues, Giovanni continued. They undermine you at almost every opportunity, and insist that your appointment is only a temporary one. The only ally you had in that room seemed to be your partner and perhaps the Archduke Felix. King Edgar II, expectant as he is, likely expects a grand showing from you. Giovanni leaned forward. You need this meeting to go well. We have time enough not to indulge the fact that you sit alongside a criminal. It would be in our best interest to leave and return at a later date to secure a better arrangement with our Republic from Count Faust. Correct on every point except one, Isabella said. It wouldn't be in your best interest to leave now. Giovanni gestured patiently. Explain, please. My brother Edgar is as you described. Decisive and expectant. She nodded in agreement. There are 2 things that he hates above all. Losing, and being embarrassed. How is that relevant? Your republic relies greatly on importing grain from Dauphine, Isabella continued. You have several cities the size of our capital. You're able to sustain such urban areas only because of imported grain. She leaned onto the table. And you've recently lost access to the only other source of grain that you have. The 3 across from her were trained professionals. She only noticed concern in the expression of one. It was enough to tell her that the knowledge from her past life was correct. That's incorrect, Giovanni said. We retain a steady supply of grain from the Rhine-and-Baltic Commonwealth. The Rhine-and-Baltic Commonwealth recently suffered a disastrous invasion from 3 hostile powers, Isabella pressed forth, undeterred. They were partitioned between the powers. And all 3 of these new players are entirely unwilling and unable to trade their grain to you. The conquered farmland has been devastated. That leaves the kingdom of Dauphine as your sole provider of grain. Isabella crossed her hands on the table politely. We're the sole bulwark between your bustling cities and widespread famine. My brother is certainly decisive enough to exploit that. Giovanni met Isabella's gaze for a time, and then turned back to consult with his advisors. Valerio, who'd been silent thus far, leaned forward. "Is that real?" he asked in a whisper. "Yes," Isabella confirmed. They arrived mere days after the coronation to get ahead of the news and renew agreements before this could be used as leverage. If they arrived ahead of the news. Valerio looked into her eyes, an unspoken question on his lips. Isabella stared at him. "Right. No questions." He leaned back and crossed his arms, looking at her with intrigue. After a time, Giovanni looked back toward Isabella. "You're threatening the lives of our people?" "I'm not unsympathetic to your problem," Isabella said. "But my brother dislikes losing, as I said. He has a more open-minded view toward laws and agreements. I believe that it's more than fair to ask for a reduction in price of certain goods you export to us, and an increase in price for certain goods we export to you. Given those two concessions, I'm confident your woes won't trouble you unduly." Giovanni crossed his arms. "You're being unreasonable. It's natural for grain prices to rise, but reducing the prices of our goods alongside that?" Isabella looked to the Duke of the Isles, and Valerio leaned in at her signal. "His Majesty has enlisted me in the task of building an armada foot of Haine," the Duke said. "I happen to have some expertise at maintaining and expanding a vast fleet. I'm sure you'd agree that I'm effective." Giovanni's gaze hardened. "So, your king intends to enter into the business of piracy? Rather than pay a fair price, he would extort us?" Isabella looked at him unflinchingly. "On the contrary. I'm trying to be fair now, so that there is no extortion later. Right now, I'm the ambassador. But later?" She leaned back onto the chair. "It's in your best interest to make an agreement now." Arthur hovered around the ambassadorial hall, somewhat out of sorts. "Why in the world am I still here?" he asked himself. Princess Isabella had given him leave to depart whenever he pleased. Ordinarily he would have suggested doing so first, but for whatever reason, he was lingering around. He had secured a mutually beneficial arrangement with Master Lodovico, and there was nothing that he would lack for further research. But still he lingered, without purpose or direction. It felt wrong, he supposed. Surrounding Isabella on all sides were people that were trying to see her be eaten alive. They reveled in every minor mistake that she made, not giving her the opportunity to prove her worth. The kingdom and its success became an irrelevant thing before the eyes of their own ambitions. To quiet his mind, Arthur wondered. "What do you suppose she's doing in there?" asked one of the chatting minor nobles. Someone whose name wasn't worth remembering. "Breaking down, I suspect," one said with a measure of mirth. "Why in the world did His Majesty give this appointment to her?" Another asked bitterly. "It's infuriating, having serious proceedings hindered by the delusions of a girl who was merely lucky enough to be born with the right name. Why did the king indulge her? She must have his favor." The man sipped his drink. "Well, that won't last. Perhaps she learned the trade of love, as her mother did. I'm told her mother was a daughter of a baron who frequented pleasure houses the king attended." After chuckling, the man continued jokingly, "And certainly not as a customer. The princess must be equally adept in plying that trade to have enticed Duke Albert and the king both." Arthur turned his head at the last comment, feeling some rising fire in his head. Almost before he could think things through, he walked toward the giggling gaggle of genteel gentlemen. "As I recall," Arthur said loudly, "questioning the virtue of the royal family is something that warrants losing your tongue." The four gossiping noblemen, and many other besides, turned their undivided attention toward Arthur. "Would you like to get started on that, or shall I help you?" Arthur continued. "We're willing to meet all of your demands if you allow Duke Valerio to be extradited and tried in Ambrose," Giovanni said to Isabella after a while. "The trial would be fair and robust, overseen by your own people if necessary." Valerio laughed. "You've sent enough assassins without a trial. I think my fate there's rather obvious." Isabella didn't even need to think. King Edgar might have poorer judgment, but even he would realize that surrendering a duke to the Republic wasn't on the table. Valerio wasn't alone in having disputes with the Republic of Ambrose, and a king vowed to protect his vassals from all external threats. If he gave up Valerio, all of the nobility would resent him. It would demonstrate that he didn't respect the fundamental agreement of the kingdom, the feudal contract to protect his subjects. He'd generate less unrest just executing Valerio himself. I'd like the Republic to consider pardoning the Duke of the Isles, Isabella countered. Pardon him? Giovanni leaned forward angrily. Even if I had the authority, why would I? This beast plagued our trade routes for years, earning enough gold to pay a king's ransom. More than that, actually, Valerio said, and Isabella looked at him sternly. Rebuked, he raised his hands and said, "But those days are long behind me, Ambassador. I'm the Lord Admiral of Dauphine, not the Pirate Lord of the Isles. Changing your title doesn't change what you are, what you've done." Giovanni shook his head firmly. "It won't happen." Valerio stood up. "I wonder if we shouldn't clear the air." "Clear the air? You must be leaving," Giovanni retorted hostilely. "To begin with, the only reason that I raided your ships was because your Serene Doge refused to pay me my due for the trading routes that I pioneered," Valerio said, walking toward the ambassadors. "Risked my life venturing to parts unknown at the promise of glory and gold. When I got back to Ambrose, what did I get? A pittance of pension, and a lot of paperwork." Valerio drew his knife, then began spinning it through his hands in an artful display of mastery. Isabella stood up, but said nothing. It was half of curiosity, and half trust. Valerio had lived to her reign, even with such a hostile relation with Ambrose. He must have gotten out of this before. But how? It must have been his own efforts. What did Ambrose get off the back of my labor? Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, things that sell for 10 times their weight in gold in places like Dauphine. He stopped spinning his knife to point it at his chest. "You gave me nothing for what I did. Instead, the Serene Doge monopolized the trade, gave the sole right to all of your cronies. He forbade people like me, who'd discovered the damn route, from trading on it. Forgive me, then, if some of us decided we needed to rob to keep our riches." Giovanni stood up from his chair. "That was a battle for the courts." "No, that was just a battle you'd have won," Valerio said, tossing his knife up and catching it to point it at Giovanni's face. "But I took my wealth back just as I'd earned it, at sea. Everyone knew what the government did was corrupt." "Your son's ship?" "He didn't get captured, Giovanni. Vittorio came to me, shipment of spices in tow, and asked to join up." "It's revisionist horse dung," Giovanni shouted. "My son was a loyal patriot of the Republic. And the Republic got sold," Valerio said calmly. He gave one final flourish of the knife, then held its handle out to Giovanni. "It was a den of corruption, rotten to the core. Your son fought for its values with me because he wasn't finding them at home. He was freer at sea than he was at home. All of my men were." Giovanni stared up at Valerio with none of his rage abating. It wasn't abating. But nor was it rising further. Now that there was a lull in their exchange, Isabella finally found space to interject. "Regardless of any personal history you might share, the fact is this," she outlined clearly. "Duke Valerio is a subject of the crown. Even if he were permitted to raise his own navy, he would never again be allowed to launch indiscriminate raids on our closest ally." Giovanni looked at Isabella, then at Valerio. Valerio set the dagger down on the table. "From what I hear, the Republic is back on its feet," he said. "The new Serene Doge is fiercely anti-corruption. He's lifted the monopoly grants, and instituted laws against nepotism. Even if I wanted to go back to piracy, there's not a chance that I'd be able to find the same following again. And, despite everything, I still admire the Republic of Ambrose, Ambassador." Silence settled between the two's intense exchange. "Bring my request for a pardon before the Serene Doge," Isabella suggested. Giovanni shook his head. "Doge Rocco won't swallow a unilateral pardon." Valerio crossed his arms. "Then let him know I'm willing to pay restitution. So long as he understands that I'm no pirate lord any longer, and have decidedly less wealth to employ, I'll pay. I'll pay gladly. As for the trade agreement, Isabella asked. Giovanni looked back to his aides, then stepped away from the table. "We'll discuss." Isabella nodded with as much composure as she could muster, but inwardly she was nervous. If she overplayed her hand helping Duke Valerio. "I'll ask you this," Giovanni said. "Can you ensure King Edgar II won't attempt a renegotiation in the event any news of our troubles reach the kingdom?" Isabella nodded. "I can. Because he's going to have much larger concerns, soon," she thought inwardly. Giovanni looked to his aides, then discussed with them briefly. Valerio retrieved his dagger and walked back to join her, watching them. "We'll draft revised terms to present," Giovanni said. "I hope that the princess is as good as her word." Isabella, surprised that they had so immediately promised to revise terms, could only give a faint nod. After she did, Giovanni and the others walked away, exiting the room. When they finally shut the door, Isabella leaned up against the table, letting her head fall limp. On her face, though, was a triumphant smile. Chapter 10. Isabella opened the room back to the main hall, where the rest of the diplomatic entourage awaited. The nobles all turned their head to her, notably quieter than they'd been when she'd last left. Duke Valerio leaned up against the door frame just behind her, watching. "The Ambrosian ambassadors will be coming by with revised terms," Isabella declared loudly. "Receive and process them well." Isabella saw some spirited joy amongst the Devane nobility. She wasn't naive enough to think they were celebrating her success, rather, they likely thought that she had made a fool of herself and earned them a far worse deal. She might have corrected the record. But she thought it would be far more entertaining to see them receive the revised drafts on their own. "It's a little petty," she reflected. "But I can't be bothered." Still, though, they were unusually quiet. She wondered what had happened in her absence to subdue them so. She looked around and saw that Arthur was gone. She was somewhat disappointed, but it wasn't unexpected. He had never before cared about events like these. Why would now be different? "You really asked something difficult of me," Valerio said, and she turned her head to look at him. "I have a great many questions that begin with how on the tip of my tongue, Your Highness." Isabella only stared at him without saying anything. "I'm sure our king will be pleased," Valerio said in closing. "Join me at a table," she said. "I have something I'd like to speak to you about." The Duke of the Isles raised a brow, but nodded and followed behind her as she walked to one of the out-of-the-way tables loaded up with fruit. She quite enjoyed fruit, and after that exhausting conversation, wanted to have some fun. She sat down, and the Duke joined her. Before either of them could speak, however, Count Faust walked up to their table. "It seems as though things didn't go as you expected, Your Highness," he said. Isabella looked up at him. "Not exactly, no." "May I join you?" Faust said, and when she nodded he sat down. "Diplomacy is a very difficult field, Your Highness. Oftentimes, it's more about connections than anything else. Regardless of how skilled your tongue, how strong your composure. It's who and what you know that usually ends up deciding things. There's no shame in failing when you're new at this." Duke Valerio leaned back, hiding his amusement with his hand. Isabella, meanwhile, ate a sugared raspberry without saying anything. "I don't have any hostility toward you innately, but I did what I had to when my position was jeopardized," he continued. "I believe that I can help you turn this around, salvage things. And if I do that for you, perhaps you can put in a good word with the king. A good word with Arthur. I don't want to be enemies with the Archwizard's heir." "Enemies?" Isabella said curiously. "I assumed he came as your partner as an excuse to speak to Ambrosian ambassadors," Faust said. "But after he defended you the way he did tonight, I see that I was mistaken. He left in a storm before I could apologize, so I was hoping that you could speak to him on my behalf." Isabella wasn't sure what he was talking about, but waited for him to continue. "If you can mend things with Arthur, I'd be happy to help abate the situation with the ambassadors." Count Faust held out a cautionary hand. "You'd have the full support of my people. I promise that much." Before she could ask what he was talking about, the doors to the ambassadorial quarters opened. The envoy scanned the room before laying eyes on her. He walked over with a small stack of papers and offered them. "This is the preliminary draft, Princess Isabella," the man said politely. "If you give your approval, we'll begin codifying wider agreements." Isabella took the papers and read over the draft. It was difficult not to raise her lips up in a smile, but she managed. The numbers were a touch better than she expected, even. They had managed to win a very favorable trade deal. Valerio leaned over to look, and she showed them to him. Thereafter, she fixed Count Faust with an emotionless look. "Can you really salvage this?" Isabella asked. "It simply seems too challenging. I don't know if even your diplomatic prowess could manage." Duke Valerio snickered, looking away as he grabbed a pear from the fruit platter to distract himself. "Let me see it," the Count said. "I'll do what I can, I promise, Your Highness." Isabella offered the papers. "It seems I overestimated my own acuity. How vexing." The Count took the papers, then began reading them. Isabella watched his face with amusement. The barely concealed happiness on his face slowly deadened into intense scrutiny. And then, into pale-faced embarrassment. He rose to his feet, looking at the man that had entered. "Are these the right documents?" He held them out to the ambassador. "There hasn't been any mistake, has there?" Valerio finally couldn't hold his laughter. Count Faust looked between him and Isabella, aghast. "They are correct, Count," Isabella said. "You seem panicked. Can you fix it, or is it simply beyond redemption?" Count Faust couldn't even manage a retort. He stood there holding the papers, struck mute and dumb, as everyone looked on with a mix of concern and hope. "Given how naive and inexperienced I am, I trust that you can handle the proceedings from here, Count Faust. If negotiations were to break at this point when the preliminary draft is already as it is?" She leaned forward on the table. "Why? I imagined the king would be rather furious. I imagined there'd be nothing you could say to the king to convince him to stay his wrath." Count Faust looked at her, his hands trembling. "If you want my good word to reach the king, do your best, Heroine," she said coldly. Count Faust meekly nodded. "Absolutely, Your Highness. My very best." Isabella turned her attention to the fruit platter. There was still plenty of day left, and plenty of time to have a good evening. Count Faust and his cronies would do all of the paperwork for her, and they'd do it the very best they could, elsewise the sword would surely fall on them. Asterisk. "By the gods," Valerio said as he and Isabella looked out to the ocean on the balcony. "If ambassadorial receptions were ordinarily this entertaining, I might begin attending more." Isabella watched the sea without saying anything in response, but she was similarly satisfied. "You mentioned there was something you wanted to talk to me about," the Duke of the Isles said, jumping up to sit on the railing. Isabella looked up at him. She'd been thinking this request through, but she had some questions to levy before she asked it. "You said you dealt with assassins?" Isabella asked. Valerio shrugged. "No one worth mentioning." "And if it was someone worth mentioning?" Isabella continued. "Do you think you could emerge alive?" Valerio looked at her curiously. "Are you expressing concern, Your Highness?" She looked at him without answering. "Yes," he eventually said. "I can hold my own. As I told you not long after you offered to be my protector." Isabella felt a little embarrassed thinking back to the words she had said to him, but she didn't dwell on it. She leaned against the railing, looking at him squarely. "Duke Albert is steadfastly committed to." The words caught in her throat. She hadn't realized how uncomfortable the prospect made her until she tried to say it. "Duke Albert wants an engagement," she finally managed. "To me." Valerio gave her his full attention, allowing her time to speak her mind. "He's close allies with the king," Isabella continued, looking out to the sea to calm her mind. "I need an ally. I need a shield." She looked at him. "Considering what I've done for you today, I was wondering if you would be willing." Valerio didn't respond, and Isabella felt the need to give him reasons to agree. "All you would need to do is enter into a temporary engagement with me," Isabella said. "Long enough for me to find a more permanent solution to the problem. I wouldn't ask anything of you in the way of other favors, rest assured. Considering what we achieved here today, I thought." The favor would be worth at least that much. I don't have much in the way of backing or allies, but tonight should illustrate at least some of my capability, Isabella continued. I can help you with favors in turn. Whatever matters you want dealt with at court, I can assist you. All I want, all I need, really, is time. Time, and freedom. Isabella didn't entirely trust Duke Valerio. She didn't think she'd be able to trust anyone after what her last life had taught her. She did think, though, that he could be relied on for this. Perhaps he could have earned that pardon on his own, but he'd seen some of what she was able to do, and didn't seem to revile her company. Pivotally, her brother wouldn't allow him to exert dictatorial control over her as Albert had done. Convincing King Edgar will likely be difficult, Valerio said. Are you confident of that? Relatively, Isabella confirmed. I've thought of some things I could say. Valerio looked at her silently, and Isabella's heart beat in anticipation of his answer. If he asked for some time to think, she wasn't quite sure what she'd do. The Duke of the Isles nodded. I'll help you. Isabella could barely describe the feeling of relief that washed over her. It felt as though something that had been choking her suddenly released its grip, allowing air to flow back into her lungs. She turned toward the sea, trying to contain her breathing. She hadn't realized how much this had been weighing at her until she found a cure. It was like she had bought her life back after another had sold it. When Isabella finally gained back her bearings, she looked at Valerio and said, Are you sure? I'm certain, Valerio confirmed. If you can convince the king, I'll do it. Isabella let out a long sigh of relief. Thank you, she said as earnestly as she'd ever been. And? I'm sorry. It seems that I've drawn assassins away from you, only to have them pointed right back. Valerio cocked his head back. Albert is that spiteful. Isabella leaned against the railing and looked up, where the day transitioned to night. More than you could possibly imagine. This engagement was a temporary measure, nothing more. Who better than a fearless pirate for these stormy seas? Chapter 11 Arthur sat in his private quarters in the Archwizard's residence, stewing over last night. The man that he'd confronted had managed to weasel his way out of any punishment. He had claimed that when he'd been talking about the trade of love, he was speaking about the finer arts like poetry. When he referred to a pleasure house, he had only been referring to a house that makes people happy, not a brothel or something more indecent. That was the problem with those cretins. The things that they said never went quite over the line, only towed it. After that, he hadn't been able to stand their presence any longer. He had left decisively. He did feel some guilt about leaving Isabella there alone, but he couldn't stand to rub shoulders with those people any longer. He'd be sure and explain that when he went to help her with her monologue. Arthur reached over and retrieved a paper. Though there wasn't much he could do about last night, he wanted to at least write a formal complaint about the people involved. Harassment like that would never be permitted in the Archwizard's retinue. Surely the king wouldn't want such a thing to fester in his court either. He didn't know much about the relationship between King Edgar and Princess Isabella, but they were siblings. That had to count for something. Arthur went through the events, documenting many of the things that the nobility had done at the direction of Count Faust. He made sure to tie it back to the Count so that the man couldn't avoid any reprimand. The writing came to him easily, as much of the harassment that she'd endured had stuck in his mind. When it was done, Arthur looked over his writing. It was neat, concise, and objective. Objectively, the princess had been wronged. Objectively, there was disharmony in the royal court. And as an objective party, it should be Arthur's responsibility to set things straight, for the good of Dauphine. That was all this was. ****. The Duke of the Isles. King Edgar listened, intrigued. I didn't think you had such tastes, sister. After your choice of partner last night, I was perhaps expecting to be pleasantly surprised. I thought you might offer Arthur of Hammer up to me on a platter. Instead. A base-born pirate? It isn't about his stock, Isabella insisted. It's about what he can do for the kingdom. Everyone knows the name of the Duke of the Isles, from the far-flung north to the Republic of Ambrose. His mere presence at the ambassadorial reception last night quieted the room. Reputation is reputation, but power is power. Edgar rubbed his hands together ponderously. I failed to see how he could be more useful to me than Duke Albert. Isabella swallowed. Now that he'd brought Duke Albert's name out to the open, this would be the final, decisive struggle. His reputation came from the power that he once wielded. You've expressed some ambitions to build a grand armada, Isabella continued. And I believe that's an idea that could decide the future of the entire kingdom. The Republic of Ambrose is only worthy of our time because their vast fleets depart to the shores of distant realms, bringing back vast riches. And? Edgar pressed. Duke Valerio was able to tap into those vast riches. Isabella put a hand to her chest as she continued. I could be the chain that binds him to Dauphine. And with such a mad dog chained to the kingdom, it would be inevitable for you to effortlessly propel the kingdom to an unprecedented golden age. Edgar rubbed his chin contemplatively. I'll think about it. For now, leave me alone, my head hurts. He waved her away. I'll have some gold sent to you for what you did. People say it was exceptional, apparently. I'll decide for myself later. It hurt a little for all of her efforts to be so casually dismissed with, it was exceptional, apparently. Isabella wondered if she should push her luck and try for further persuading. Looking at the king, she judged he was hungover from drinking last night. It was often in nights like this that he would punish people arbitrarily for annoying him. She certainly didn't want to be the subject of one such punishment. Thank you for your time, Your Majesty, she said in disappointment, hoping there would be another time for her to win his assent to the engagement. Isabella left the room with a heavy heart. Asterisk. Did the talks with the Ambrosians go well? Roderick asked as he poured tea for Duke Valerio. Duke Valerio watched the cup, then looked at Roderick. Went quite differently from how I expected, but yes. It definitely went well. Roderick looked at him brightly. Can't we perhaps expect a pardon from the Republic? Valerio picked up his tea, raising it to his lips with a smile. I believe we can, provided I pay some restitution. Since we still have some friends in Ambrose, I think the sentence will be relatively light. We can put things in motion once more. Roderick exhaled in satisfaction. Your Grace. That is perhaps the best news you've brought back in a long while. It will be a relief to no longer have to endure the presence of black-garbed men at nightfall, and hurried disposal of bodies in the wee hours of the morning. Valerio set down his cup, then looked at his butler. Things may be unchanged, actually. Roderick looked uneasy. Surely the pardon will discourage further assassination attempts, even from rogue actors within the Republic. I'm getting engaged, Roderick, Valerio said, throwing his arms out. Roderick grew stiff from surprise, but quickly regained his composure. My natural assumption is that this unfortunate woman is hiring assassins to attempt to end the engagement, Roderick said dryly. She asked me, actually, Valerio said in amusement. How desperate is she? Roderick asked in concern. It's a temporary arrangement, Valerio continued. She's receiving unwanted attention from a certain Duke Albert. She suspects he's so desperate to have her hand as to send assassins after me. The princess. Roderick said, beyond surprised. May I inquire in the politest possible terms what in the world happened to living Loki? The butler went silent for a bit, and then said more seriously, correct me if I'm wrong, but this considerably complicates our plans. We'll simply have to change them, the Duke said decisively. You sound like the new king, being so casually dismissive of the woes of your loyal subjects, Roderick said, and Valerio gave him a pointed gaze. But you must have your reasons. Valerio nodded, then looked to his butler. He paused a bit, mulling a question over in his head, then asked, do you think there would have ever been a time where I met the princess before being named the Duke of the Isles? I don't see how, Roderick said. She's a young princess who seldom left the royal palace her entire life. I doubt she's been aboard a ship, let alone one you would have been able to raid. King Edgar I was not known for granting his daughters many liberties. She asked if my eyes had always been this color, Valerio said, pointing to his eyes. Changed the subject quickly, too, but I don't think it was a question born of nothing. Maybe she heard something, Or maybe we've met before. I can't see how either can be true. Roderick looked greatly concerned. Who could have told her? You, myself. Any others that come to mind are entirely trusted figures, or dead. I'm not sure. Valerio pulled out his knife from his belt, and began to spin it through his fingers idly. But she seems to know a lot of things that others wouldn't, ordinarily. And she seems far from sheltered. Roderick took the knife from Valerio's hand and spun it through his own, until he offered the handle back to Valerio. It's considered improper to play with one's knife in polite society, Roderick criticized. If you are to be the fiancé of a princess, you need to learn at least that much, Your Grace. The Duke of the Isles took the dagger back, then laughed as he stowed it away. Always more to learn, he agreed. Only other men are impressed by twirling knives around like a dandy, Roderick continued, making Valerio laugh. It makes you look like a brute. It's just a habit when I'm thinking about something, or when I'm angry, Valerio defended. Earned me plenty of respect among my fellows over the years. The ladies are impressed by other, more decent displays, Roderick asserted. It's overdue for you to learn them, I should think. Valerio leaned forward on the table. The princess made it quite clear it's a temporary arrangement. He paused, tapping the table as if working through a thought. Still. No harm in learning. ****. Your Majesty, said the servant in a quiet voice. What is it? King Edgar looked at the servant in irritation. I told you, my head hurts. I don't intend to do anything until it ceases to ache. The Archwizard's heir, Arthur, has sent a formal complaint to you about the ambassadorial reception last night, the servant said quickly, placing the letter on the table by his bedside. That's all. After exhaling in annoyance, he let the letter linger there for a while. As his mind worked, though, he couldn't stop his curiosity about what the letter might say. King Edgar reached over and took it, holding it to the faint light in the room from a distant candle. The text was neat and large, fortunately, troubling him none despite his headaches. As he read through it, he furrowed his brows in irritation. He didn't even reach the end before tossing it aside and reaching for the sash to summon his servants. The servants hastily obeyed the summons, fearing to anger their mercurial master. In only a few seconds there were 3 people standing before him. Prepare a regal attire with the color tones of war, Edgar commanded hurriedly. Call for court in the throne room, convening in 3 hours. Ensure that Count Faust, Princess Isabella, Duke Valerio and Arthur of Hamor are in attendance. He rose to his feet. As a matter of fact, ensure that most everyone is in attendance. Tell Knight Commander Gasper that his attendance is required for an official act of royal arbitration. It will be done, Your Majesty, the leading servant said obsequiously. Is there anything else? Ensure that Gasper brings a well-sharpened sword, he said coldly. Something that would have no trouble cutting through a bone. Chapter 12. When Isabella was abruptly singled out and summoned to the royal court, that did little to quiet her anxiety. She'd already seen King Edgar 2 once today, and judged that he was hungover. That boded poorly for his already bad judgment. When it became apparent that she was one of many that had been summoned, she was further uneased. Entering into the throne room of Dauphine, Isabella could recall nothing but bad memories. Even when she'd been sitting up there on that throne being coronated by the Archbishop, it wasn't entirely without its bitter memories. How many executions had been held here? How many coups had started here? They were almost without count. His Majesty has instructed that he wishes for you to be close to the throne, the leading servant told her. Please stand there. The place arranged for her was right by the stairs leading up to the throne, right beside the red carpet. She stood there, undoubtedly drawing the gaze of the many new arrivals that poured into the throne room. Before long, Arthur of Hamor also joined, standing just opposite her. 2 columns of people formed on either side of the red carpet in the center of the throne room. Soon enough, an attendant walked out from behind the throne. All kneel for His Majesty the King of all Dauphine, King Edgar. The man shouted. The whole room obeyed, falling to their knees. Isabella took the opportunity to look around. The majority of the high nobility were in attendance. She spotted Archduke Felix, Duke Albert, Duke Valerio, and countless others of equal rank. The archbishop was in attendance, even. Soon enough King Edgar walked out, looking resplendent. He wore dark colors flanked by red, symbolizing his intent. Isabella's thoughts darkened. "Rise," the king shouted, and everyone obeyed at once. He looked out at all of them, then sat down in his throne. Princess Isabella, Duke Valerio, Count Faust, Arthur of Hamor approached the throne. Isabella felt nauseous when she was called upon, but proceeded closer nonetheless. She was soon joined by those that had been called, each of whom seemed similarly unsettled. She took her place at the edge of the line, with only Duke Valerio to her right. They all stood at the base of the stairs. "Arthur," the king said, looking down upon him, "will you affirm that everything you wrote in your letter of complaint is fair and honest?" Called upon, Arthur stepped forward and kneeled. For a few moments he was silent, but then he said, "Yes, Your Majesty. I laid out the events of the reception objectively." King Edgar looked over. "Crier," he said, calling a servant over, "read out the letter to the assembled." Isabella listened closely as the letter was read out. It was an objective retelling of the prior night, including the disparagements made against her person and the efforts made to undermine her position as the ambassador. She could only lower her head, though, knowing that this was the reason all of them had been called. After attempting to rebuke a nobleman for a comment I believed questioned the princess' virtue, I became overwhelmed with rage and left the venue, the crier read. Isabella looked at Arthur. The man looked off-balanced, but nevertheless committed to his words. She was grateful he had made some attempt to protect her reputation, but there was a reason she didn't bring this matter before King Edgar. She clenched her hands together tightly. "Duke Valerio," the king said once the letter was finished, "will you affirm Arthur's words?" The duke stepped forward. "I wasn't present from the beginning, but from my understanding, the wizard speaks truly, Your Majesty." King Edgar nodded. "Count Faust," he said, "what do you have to say for yourself?" Count Faust stepped forward and kneeled. "I have no excuse for my actions, Your Majesty," he admitted calmly. "Out of base jealousy and greed, my judgment erred from what is natural and good. I can ask only for your grace, hoping that my years of service to the crown as a loyal servant will outshine this one blemish." Isabella assumed the count hoped his admittance of fault might abate the king's wrath somewhat. "Ascend, Princess Isabella," King Edgar said, calling her forward. With butterflies roaming her stomach, Isabella did her best to walk forward with dignity. She walked up the stairs, her footsteps echoing through the silent hall. When she arrived at the throne, she kneeled. "Your Majesty," she said. "Rise, and look upon the count," the king said. Isabella did so, looking back at him and the hundreds of gathered nobilities uneasily. "The count has undermined you, my personal appointment for this reception," the king said. "In so doing, his actions could be interpreted as a direct challenge to me and my royal authority. In attempting to embarrass you before envoys of the state, his actions could be likened to treason." King Edgar's voice was hard and unforgiving. "Tell us, Princess. How do you wish for Count Faust to be punished?" Isabella considered her words carefully. She didn't feel the need to push this further. For her, embarrassing Count Faust with success had been revenge enough. She understood his position and his situation, and the insults levied against her were nothing new. She decided to give her fair and honest judgment. Despite the Count's efforts, the ambassadorial reception was a success, Isabella began. "We succeeded in achieving more favorable terms for the kingdom than even our father had enjoyed with the Republic. In light of this fact, and in light of his previous service to the crown, I would temporarily suspend the Count from his role as head ambassador, levy a fine upon him and all offenders, and arrange a public humiliation." She looked at Edgar. "I believe this gathering today qualifies as the latter punishment, Your Majesty." King Edgar looked upon Faust. "The princess wishes for you to be temporarily suspended, fined, and humiliated, Count. Are you willing to endure these punishments without protest?" Faust knelt and lowered his head deeply. "I am, Your Majesty. I will use my suspension as a period to reflect upon my inexcusable behavior." King Edgar leaned back in his throne. "Still, that is the opinion of the gentler sex. A king cannot afford to be so merciful. My opinion is different." He gestured toward Knight Commander Gasper, standing at attendance not far away. "Gasper. Cut off his head." Murmurs spread throughout the hall. No voice was as loud as Gasper's, though, who loudly asked, "What? Did I stutter?" Edgar demanded. "Separate the traitor's head from his body." Gasper stood there woodenly for a moment, but a prodding from one of his fellows brought him back to attention. Isabella looked to the floor as the events proceeded. "Your Majesty, mercy!" Faust shouted. "Please, mercy!" Some other people in the crowd boldly stepped out to defend Faust verbally, but their loud voices only seemed like an annoyance to the hungover king. Gasper kept glancing back to the monarch, obviously uneasy with his instruction, but the king didn't rescind his order. When Gasper drew his blade, Faust attempted to run. Other holy paladins stepped forward to stop him, grabbing him and bringing him back before the king. Faust was placed at the foot of the stairs, and Gasper raised his blade high. The Knight Commander looked at King Edgar, perhaps desperately hoping the order would be recalled. But the pleas of those present could not change the whim of the king. Isabella closed her eyes as the sword fell, hearing a sound that she'd unfortunately heard many times before. The throne room went dead silent after Faust's decapitation. "Now, on to other matters," King Edgar continued. Servants emerged to remove the body, but Edgar held out his hands. "Stop. Leave the body there." He waved them away, and after hesitating, they left. "Duke Valerio. Ascend." The Duke stepped past the body of Faust, rising up the stairs to the throne. He knelt, but Edgar quickly told him to rise. As my sister outlined, despite the efforts by Count Faust to make it otherwise, the ambassadorial reception was the most successful of any ambassadorial reception, perhaps ever. "I expect as much of those under my command," the king said. "As such, the princess deserves a reward. And I've decided upon it." "Crier," he called out. The crier stepped forward again, holding a prepared document. "Princess Isabella, for extraordinary service to the crown, is to be awarded 1,000 gold coins." King Edgar nodded. "Furthermore, Duke Valerio, do you consent to an engagement between yourself and Princess Isabella?" Valerio regarded the king evenly. Isabella felt a dark pit in her stomach. After what had just happened, there was no reason for the Duke to agree to the engagement. She'd just been nailed to the sinking ship that was the king. Valerio was smart, and politically neutral. Frankly, if she were in his shoes, she wasn't sure she would agree. But Valerio nodded. "I do, Your Majesty." His confirmation shocked Isabella. "Wonderful," the king said flippantly. "After a 6-month period of courtship, you will be wed. Descend, both of you." Isabella and Valerio walked side by side down the stairs. She couldn't help but look upon the head separated from the body, still lying there and turning the red carpet a far darker color. "Let this serve as an example to all present," King Edgar said loudly. "The princess, a loyal and faithful servant doing her best to strengthen the crown. And Count Faust, a petty schemer who dared challenge my good wisdom and judgment. Allow them to be the models upon which all of you must base yourself," King Edgar finished. "My father is gone. It would be wise of all of you to remember that." Isabella looked around. Judging from the calculating gazes, all of them realized that Edgar the Great had died. And in his place, Edgar the Terrible had risen. Duke Valerio hovered near Isabella as they rejoined the congregation of nobility, doing his best to position himself so that she couldn't see the headless body. He lightly touched her shoulder and asked, "Are you all right?" Isabella looked up at him, her expression as indecipherable as ever. "Yes," she answered in a quiet whisper. "I just didn't expect this." Valerio concurred with a nod, looking around. Arthur of Hamor, who'd ostensibly instigated this, looked quite rattled. He wasn't alone in that. The nobles that had so ardently defended Count Faust looked mortified, as if their own heads might be parted from their shoulders in a moment. All of the others were similarly distraught. This wasn't a small issue. A prominent count, perhaps the most prominent count, had been executed without due process. Valerio was no stranger to shows of strength to inspire fear. But this was a farce. The count had erred, certainly, but Isabella had been wise to give him a relatively light punishment. The king had been given the perfect way out, but had trampled all over that in sake of establishing himself as a ruler to be feared. Why was it a mistake? Because fear inspires two things, flight or fight. Amidst the calculating gazes, however, Valerio noticed one set of eyes fixed on him. He turned to look, and saw the hateful glare of Duke Albert. He met the old man's gaze. He'd seen looks like that before. They came from people that were going to be a problem. They came from people that would act obsessively, compulsively. When the king dismissed them all, Albert turned and faded into the crowd. Valerio joined Isabella, intending to make sure that she was all right after the way that things had occurred. She seemed to be holding up well, but people could do many things in public only to shatter in private. When they were alone in one of the decadent halls of the royal palace, Isabella stopped and looked at him. He turned to her. "That was a disaster," she said. Valerio didn't say anything, but inwardly he agreed. "The king's just shown his true nature," Isabella said. "And he made a particular point of holding me up as an example. Meaning, chaos is coming to my door." She stared at him for a while, then asked, "You had to have known that immediately. Why in the world did you agree to the engagement?" "I said I would," Valerio responded. "And I did." Isabella's face was complex tapestry of emotions after he said that. There was one he couldn't miss, though. Suspicion. He'd gained some insight into why that was warranted, considering the people she lived around. "It seems I'll be in your care for a while," Isabella said formally and aloofly. "We'll speak again soon." Isabella walked away, and Valerio watched the back of her head for a time. When she turned the corner, he walked to a window in the hall, looking out across the bustling city below somberly. Valerio felt that instinct to play with his knife again, but suppressed it by wiping his coat down. Trust would be difficult to earn from someone who'd grown up in a court like this.